All right, friends, how you doing? I want to start with a question for everyone in the room. I want you to think about failure, about the experience of failure. What words come to mind? What pops into your head when you think about failure? Just yell it out. Disappointment. Embarrassment. Did I hear proud? Nice. You've seen this presentation before? No. Learning experience. Amazing. Okay. Unemployment. Please.
Found another important lesson upon reviewing experience.
Nice. Anyone else? Failure? Risk. Absolutely. So here in my hand, shortly, are a couple of editions of the Engineers Without Borders annual failure report. So this is a report that comes out alongside their annual report, documents stories from across the organization of things that just didn't work, right from the field level to the CEO. This particular edition has 19 pages, 14 stories, prove they failed at least, but probably more than 14 times that year. Now, what comes to mind when you think of this organization and the people who wrote these stories to be published publicly? What words pop into your head when you think of them? Brave, yeah. Honest. Accountable, transparent. Committed. Do you notice a difference in those two sets of words? It's remarkable how differently we perceive the experience of failure compared with how we perceive people and organizations who fail and are able to talk openly about it and hopefully learn from it. And it's really in that spirit of expanding our perceptions of failure that I get to stand up here today. And then we have the wonderful Dr. Gavin Armstrong and Hilary Hartley with us here, who will help us explore the tension that's often there between that need for innovation with our tendency towards risk aversion. And they will also help us role model dealing with failure very well by sharing their own stories with us. So 3 objectives: exploring that tension between risk aversion and the need for innovation, practice and build our skills at communicating failures really effectively in a way that maximizes learning, and consider how we might bring this home and start to change our organizational cultures. So I'll hop in with the framing piece. I don't have all the answers. I have a microphone, but that doesn't mean I have all the answers. I don't think anyone knows the one right way to deal with failure well. So I encourage you and invite you to think of this session as the beginning of that exploration for you. Because at the end of an hour and a half, 3 of us, we're gonna go home. You're going to go back to your offices, and it's going to be up to you to make sense of what you experienced here and try to take that home and try to change your culture. So I really invite you, as you engage with these activities and hear these ideas, that you're doing so with an eye and a mind to thinking about how you apply them when you get back to your workplaces. The other thing I will say is that this is not a in-depth session into the depths of failure theory. I recognize that this is a room of exceptional, talented, hardworking, intelligent, innovative people. This session is about acknowledging that exceptional, talented, hardworking, intelligent, innovative people fail every day. And not out of incompetence, but because the work we do is incredibly complex. And complexity means that there is going to be elements of both success and failure in everything we do. So our expectation for success, for 100% success, drives our learning underground. So we actually need to start to think about success differently. Start to think about success in terms of figuring out what bits didn't work and maximizing what we can learn from those, that becomes success. And in this same vein, I like to redefine failure as well. Dictionary describes failure as a lack of success, which is unhelpful and untrue a lot of the time. I instead invite everyone in this room to join me in just throwing out the dictionary's definition, and I propose a new definition. defining failure not as a lack of success, but instead as a teachable moment. And I like this definition because I hope it helps us decouple ego from activity, separate ourselves from the experience so that we can look more objectively at the failure and maximize what we can learn from it. Just because I failed doesn't mean I am a failure. Now, a very valid criticism of this definition is that it paints a rosy picture on something that, of course, we know is bad. Like, believe me, I know we want success. You're not going to hear me say, like, oh yeah, let's celebrate failure, let's embrace failure. No, I get it, we want success. Failure is bad, but failure is inevitable. So I don't mean to sugarcoat the experience. So what I hope this definition does is just say, look, we work on really complex, difficult problems. Some element of failure is inevitable. Therefore, even though we want total success, it's not possible. So the best thing we can do is treat the elements that don't work as teachable moments. The other thing I like about this definition is we have this funny human tendency to attribute successes to our own brilliance and failures to external factors. So you think about that for a second, and it's absurd, obviously. Both our failures and our successes are, of course, caused by both our own brilliance, or lack thereof, as well as external factors. So I hope what this definition does is ask us not to fall into that trap of externalizing blame, as Dr. Linneo talked about, but instead really try to internalize that responsibility for learning absolutely everything we can. So in this session, and with Hillary and Gavin here, we're going to explore that tension between risk aversion and the need for innovation. To do that, I think, requires a very important concept, and that is that not all failures are created equally. We have this one word to describe a huge range of experiences. Not all failures are created equally, to me, really means disambiguating between what Harvard professor Amy Edmondson would call blameworthy versus praiseworthy failure. Very obviously, we're going to treat all those failures as teachable moments, but very obviously a failure caused by incompetence or worse, moral lapse, we have very different tolerance for that failure compared with our tolerance for, say, a failure caused by experimentation and hypothesis testing in pursuit of innovation. So we need to treat those differently. So I'll give you a couple of examples of praiseworthy and blameworthy failures. This is from Julie Morath. She's president of Health Quality Institute. She defined 4 blameworthy behaviors, things that she would always take issue with. She'd always have a problem with. You're always going to be blamed for. This kind of failure we have zero tolerance for. She described it as reckless, disruptive, or disrespectful, knowingly violating standards, working well beyond your boundaries, or failure to learn over time, or making the same mistake over and over again. So I bring this up as an example because I think it's really important to know for yourself, what are your truly blameworthy failures? What is really not acceptable? And clarify that. And for your teams, so that everyone knows, okay, right, those kind of failures we should never do. That's just not acceptable, so that you create room for the more praiseworthy or acceptable failures. So this is from a list created by a UK-based global retailer, 10 absolutely acceptable failures. Failures they want to create room for. And I won't read them all, but things like, the cost is contained, or we've documented all of our assumptions, or the opportunity is simply worth the risk to us. And they wrote these up because they wanted to create room for those more acceptable failures. And they do that because, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows the pace of change of our world, and your worlds in your jobs is changing rapidly. You have an ever-changing workforce, the demand for increasingly sophisticated technological services, the push towards open government. You have all these changes happening that are going to require that you are able to create room for innovation and try new things. And doing that, trying those new things and managing the risk of trying new things requires dealing with failure well. Basically, getting really good at having those open conversations about what's working and what's not. So we can get good at detecting failure early, analyzing it effectively, maximizing what we can learn from it. I'm going to move over here to sitting with our fabulous panelists. We want to be able to navigate that tension between innovation and our tendency towards risk aversion, and be able to acknowledge our failures in doing that. And luckily, well, that is obviously a lot easier said than done. Fortunately, we have two very talented panelists on stage with me here today to help us do that. So we've got Dr. Gavin Armstrong. Gavin is founder and CEO of Lucky Iron Fish. He loves to cook and eat, and he always tries to do cooking class wherever and whenever he travels. Sounds like I'm trying to find you a date. Anyone? No? And Hillary Hartley is Deputy Minister, responsible for digital government and Chief Digital Officer for the province of Ontario. So for those, and of course many, many other reasons, we are very fortunate to have them on stage with us today. So Hillary, maybe I'll start with you. There is,
Hello.
There's a lot of scrutiny on the government, particularly with the shift towards open government, that I get the sense, and certainly in the lead up to this, heard that a lot of people feel like failure is not acceptable. It won't be forgiven. So how, I guess, can you speak to that risk aversion, and possibly more importantly, how do we protect the room for innovation, to try new things, to take those risks when there's this fear that we're going to end up on the front page of the newspaper?
I think, well, first of all, I'm relieved and somewhat disappointed that I changed out of the t-shirt and blazer that I had on earlier, because I think we would have lined up very well. I know, it's a red shoe crew. But, I think making space for failure in my job and in the context of my job is extremely important. One, because it happens. We just have to acknowledge that it happens. And two, because when you make space for it, you start to acknowledge, as you said, there are acceptable failures. There are acceptable ways to fail. There are acceptable situations to fail in. And my job, I think, with our team and with the folks that we work with, is to have that conversation and to start that conversation around, if you listen to startup founders, you listen to anyone that is kind of on stage talking about lean startup or agile or anything like that, they are talking about small failures. They're talking about fail small, fail fast, and then move on. And I think that while some people feel like they can't relate to that, that is why we do preach about Agile and about the benefit of those methodologies, whether it's capital A Agile and you're doing capital S Scrum. I don't really care. What I care about is that our team is thinking small, and we are having a hypothesis, as you mentioned, about what we are going to build, what we're going to try to execute on, knowing the outcome that's ahead of us, but knowing that we have to iterate our way there. And I think that really is the benefit of Agile inside government, at least sort of in my experience, and why I really talk a lot about that, is that you do start to make space for understanding that you're going to fail. You're sprinting every 2 weeks, you're trying to build something, and you're probably not going to get it right every 2 weeks. You're going to have to learn something. You're going to have to put it in front of people and understand that the assumption you made didn't work out, that they didn't find the button that you thought was obvious, that they didn't understand the question that you thought was obvious, and you have to be able to learn and change and make those small changes that are following your users, following your stakeholders, and getting toward the outcome, not necessarily a scoped thing, but the outcome. And that's what's, I think, most important, sort of in my job and in my position in the conversations that I get to have with other leaders, is talking about, really bringing things down to a small, bite-sized thing, even if the end result is a big, big thing that you're trying to deliver on.
And Gavin, there is this push towards government to behave more like a business in many cases. And I know you have some experience with bureaucracies, but you spend your days, and I'm sure many nights, running a startup. And so I'm curious, from your experience, what could and perhaps should government learn from the startup world to be able to create that room for innovation?
So it was just said that it's important to fail small and fail fast. For me, it's also very important to fail cheap. You don't want to have an expensive failure and have to try and justify that. I think when you're looking at the public sector, people are very concerned about where their money is being spent and how it's being spent. And if you're in a somewhat adversarial environment where there are people running to try and replace that particular party, you're afraid, I think, to acknowledge failure because it can be used against you. In my view, it's very important to, if you articulate why you failed, I think it can soften the blow of it. And so you said it's a teachable moment, and I think that's absolutely correct. If you say, this is why we got it wrong, and this is how we're going to do it right the next time, I think no one can fault you on that because that's a typical human response. But I think if it's just, we screwed up, oops, then that's not going to go over very well.
Yeah, and I guess for both of you, both of you talking about that, the Agile and speaking openly about it, how, to me the term safe fail comes to mind. Like, how do we make failure safer how might all the people in this room shift their organizations to somehow make failure safer? And is that possible?
So something we do at Lucky Iron Fish is in our office every Monday morning at 9:15, we have a check-in. And it's an opportunity for the entire staff, and if we have consultants in that day or any other stakeholder, they participate. And it's a space where we break the ice with our weekend, what we did, etc. But then we talk about what's on the agenda for the week, what help we need to get those jobs done. And if things are delayed, and things are often delayed, why is that and how can we help? And so it's creating a safe space to almost prevent failure or to talk about why things are starting to fail, particularly around deadlines. And because everyone's doing it, people feel more confident in doing it themselves. I think if we were just in a meeting and I called someone out and said, why is that late? That's becoming very hostile, but in this space. So it's about creating a space where you can do it with a team and making sure it's being led appropriately.
Yeah, I think building on that, excuse me. Building on that, it's very important for folks like Gavin and I to model that. So the leads of teams and for leadership to create the space by modeling that. So owning it, that I fail every week, that I mess something up, I forget to send an email I was supposed to send, I miss a deadline. And I think owning that and modeling it, culture starts from the top of an organization. And so as leaders, it's just very important for me, I think, whether it's around this concept of failure or whether it's, other portions of our leadership philosophy. It's important for me to just be living that, breathing that, and modeling that so that it does trickle down throughout the organization. To give, I think, an example, a concrete example like Gavin did, one thing that we've started, at my last job, I always struggled with our senior management meetings. It never felt like we had the right group of folks at the table to make the decisions we needed to make. And certainly sometimes we would call folks in, but it was always sort of last minute, and can we get on the agenda and this, that, or the other. And so one of the things that I posited to my leadership team when so we started first I've only been in this job since April, so started digging into things in May and setting up the cadence around weekly meetings or leadership meetings and things like that. And when you think of a digital organization needs to be responsive. It needs to be able to make quick decisions, but also the right decision at the right level of the organization. So thinking outside of hierarchy bands and salary bands, allowing people to communicate across and up and throughout the organization without fear a reprisal of some sort. I didn't talk to my director who needs to talk to the assistant deputy whatever and make its way up. So really making the space for those conversations and sort of smashing those silos in that hierarchy. People talk about hierarchy like it's this bad thing. Hierarchy is actually good. It helps gets things done. When it becomes bad is when it's limiting around communication around an organization or transparency or anything like that. And so I think that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it is just really concretely, we decided to open up and broaden our view of our senior management team meetings. So our SMT became the SMT Plus. And we are making an effort to get the right people at that table every 2 weeks to make decisions, whether it's with, a staff person or a manager or a director, and make the right decisions. So we have what we call our buds, the buds people. So there's always 2 or 3 people that are kind of on rotation for a few weeks at a time that are coming to these meetings and adding staff or manager perspective that wouldn't normally be at that table and to help us have conversations and help us get perspective on things.
I very much appreciate what you've managed to create in your organizations, and that is why you are up on stage to share this knowledge with the folks in the room. But I wouldn't be good at my job if I didn't ask what's not working about it. I'm sure it's been hard. I'm sure there are still challenges. Can you give any insight into what you're still struggling with or what you struggled with along the way to these organizational cultures?
Sure. So it's my understanding that everyone here received a Lucky Ironfish itself. Oops. First off, I want to thank the organizing committee for providing a Lucky Ironfish to everyone. Because of our Buy One, Give One program, actually, we actually are going to donate Lucky Ironfish for free to communities around the world, meaning today's fish will actually provide improved diets for over 800 people. So thank you very much for participating in that. And so the Lucky Ironfish is a cooking tool. If you boil it for 10 minutes, it can provide a family with a portion of their daily required iron intake. It's reusable for 5 years, doesn't change the taste, color, or smell of the liquid it's cooked in, and there are no side effects from using it. So that sounds amazing, which it is, but it was a bit of a process to get there. When we started, we were in Cambodia, and we were actually using an iron disc. And though we found that to be scientifically effective, women didn't want to cook with it. They would laugh us out of their homes saying, "That looks like trash. I'm not putting garbage in my food." I mean, you picked it up on the side of the road, basically. And so we failed, and we kept saying, "No, you can use it, it's good for you." And they would throw them out, they use them as door stops, paperweights. No one used it. And after some research, we discovered that in Cambodian culture, the symbol of a fish is a symbol of luck. And so we shaped the disc like a fish, and then suddenly everyone wanted to use it because they thought it would make them lucky. And then when they were feeling healthier, they thought that was the luck of the fish. And so they would go to their neighbors and community members and say, "You have to use this product, it really, really works." Which is why we now see a compliance rate of over 94% in the families that use it. So it's an opportunity of learning from a failure, adapting it to the community we were actually trying to improve, and turning it into a fantastic success.
Challenges with Agile?
Challenges with Agile, yes. I mean, I think first and foremost, there is still a belief that Agile's illegal almost. We were actually told that on our team in the US. It's illegal, you can't do that. We were also told that we couldn't use the cloud because you can't put the cloud in an evidence bag. So there are definitely still, I think, blockers, and there are things that we do have to kind of do some education around Agile, especially in government. But again, it's really about flipping that risk scenario on its head. Projects, as I said, projects fail every week, every month. There's a stat that came out several years ago in the US that definitely the majority of large IT projects fail, but also that 40% of them never ship a single thing. They never reach a single milestone. They never ship a line of code. They never do anything. They are completely stalled and blocked at the gate. but the money has been paid, the ship has sailed, but nothing is ever delivered. And so thinking about the risk of that, like you said, you want to fail cheap. You want to shift that sort of risk profile on its head. And I think that's what Agile does. It allows you to constantly be sort of testing and iterating towards something so that you don't fail incredibly large, and you are essentially shrinking that risk to these bite-sized chunks. And to me, that's, I think, where challenges are, and what we have to, some of the hurdles we have to get over around shaping people's assumption and perception of risk, but also literally how we get there, and how we budget for it, and how we go to committee and get our money approved to be able to do this bite-sized chunk, and then be able to come back and do it again, because oftentimes not only are people wanting the full scope and wanting to know the day it's going to launch 2 years from now, but they want to know to the cent what you think you'll spend on it, and that is. We have to sort of change that. So those are a couple of things that aren't currently working.
All right, so I promised an interactive portion of this session, which is coming up next. But to help us get ready for that, the last question that I wanted to ask Gavin and Hillary was to share a story of failure, perhaps the one you learned the most from, or perhaps the one that when you think of failure, that's the story that comes to mind. You're like, oh. So Hillary, do you want to go first? All right.
I'll go first this time. Yes, when I was talking with Ashley about this, just sort of joking and saying I fail every day, every week. It's hard to think of one, but there is one that still, like you said, it just grinds at me. And it was a decade ago, but it was essentially, the goal was that we were using a well-known tool that governments use for building a content management system. And we were trying to get a content management system built. And I had done the work of essentially prototyping and designing some templates. We think we have these 5 types of pages. And so I designed those and kind of prototyped them, and we had outsourced the project to a team, and sort of soup to nuts, the team was going to handle it, but I was essentially the stakeholder. I was the person that needed to be and was working with them to sort of understand how the project was progressing and where we were going to land. And I really just simply failed at that. I outsourced too much of it, honestly, and I was not involved. When we talk about Agile, we talk about the necessity of a stakeholder being part of that sprinting team, of that team that is delivering, so that you are constantly helping folks follow that compass. We're following our users, but we also have to have the stakeholder involvement so that they know and can validate whether we are heading toward the outcome that was intended. And we'd show up and I'd get a demo each week, and they would have built something that looked like the prototype or the template that I built, and I would say, okay, great, we're on our way. And we kept moving, and just assuming that the whole sort of picture, all the pieces of the puzzle were coming together into what we needed, which was a fully functioning content management system. Weeks later, probably a couple months later, and many thousands of dollars later, we're ready to, they say, yeah, we're done, and we'd like to give you the final demo. And so I'm walking through it with them and start to understand that really we have 5 static pages. The static pages that I had demoed were now coded and part of this system, but there was no content management system built around it. There was no flow, and that was my fault, and it still sticks with me. It was a hard lesson to learn, and it's sort of a simple thing, and I simply failed at being the right kind of stakeholder to make sure that it was getting done the right way.
And I'll add, if I may, one thing to that story. When Hillary was telling me this on the phone, she said, it really changed how I am as a manager, because you didn't get fired. It was like that was a really important learning, and And as you said, you adopted that into your own management style. So creating that room for other people to fail.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was great. Gavin, you're up.
So when we mention fail fast, fail cheap, those sound great, but it's important to actually ask, how do you do that? When we had clinically proven that Lucky Ironfish worked, I was very excited, and I went out and raised some money, and I said, I'm going to develop a traveling roadshow in Cambodia. We're going to go door to door in rural communities and sell the Lucky Ironfish for just $5. They're spending $12 a month on iron pills. This is much cheaper. The value proposition is clear. The luck feature was there. It was perfect. And so I invested all of this money. I had a mascot, Dr. Fish, and I had a jingle, and it was terrible. And then we had a tuk-tuk, and all of these things. We hired salespeople, and we went out door to door, and we had to sell, I think, like 200 a month to break even. And we sold in the first 3 months, 0. And then the 4th month was like 3, and the 5th month, and by the 6-month mark, which we had now spent all of this money, that's when I said, okay, I think we have to reevaluate this. But at that point, we had already invested so much, and I was so determined to try and get it to work that I didn't actually realize that we hadn't understood how the networks of communities work in Cambodia, how there's a trust system within NGOs. Most women were getting pills for free from the government, which we hadn't realized because we didn't speak the language and ask the right questions. And so, we should have established metrics or milestones to check in and see, is this working? Because if it took me 6 months to realize that was way too long. And then so we did adapt our model, and now we're finding some more success. But that was my most expensive failure. And as a side story, I was giving an interview a couple years ago to Forbes, and I was talking about everything we were doing, and I thought it was going to be this great success story. The title of the article was "How an Entrepreneur Overcame His Arrogance and Learned His Lesson." I told you that in confidence. But so it's also important how you communicate your failures, especially to the media.
Great, so a learning around never trusting a journalist and also setting those metrics to check in early. I love it. I would love just to ask everyone to join me in thanking them for their courage to share their stories and insights. Because it is that time for the interactive portion of I guess it's a plenary workshop. Because it's easy to... It's easy to know in theory that we should all be as great at sharing our failure stories as openly and confidently as Gavin and Hillary just did, but it's another thing to actually do that in practice and do that well. So we're going to build that skill right now. So as I promised, or warned, depending on your perspective, everyone in this room is going to share their own story of failure with a partner. But of course that means that everyone in this room is going to be listening to a story of failure. So I invite you now to, just with the folks at your table, take a couple of minutes and just discuss this question. What can a listener do? Knowing you're about to share your own failure story with somebody at your table, what can a listener do to make you feel safe sharing that story and help you learn? And in this way, hopefully, we'll all become a little bit better listeners. So take a few moments, discuss with the folks at your table. What can a listener do to help you feel safe? I asked this question of, as you can imagine, dozens and dozens of groups. And I can guarantee you that every discussion at every table came up with something different, because we all need different things to help us feel safe sharing stories of failure. The list up on the screen here is kind of what I like to think of as the baseline, like just your basic ground rules for being a great listener of failure stories. And perhaps you with your groups came up with some of these. Listen. We all have those tiny hand computers that we love to play with. Put them away when you're hearing a failure story. Don't judge. Unless you're asked to, don't try to solve it. I know we're all great problem solvers, but often that's not what your teller is looking for in that moment. Be supportive and on their team. The next one's really important. It often doesn't come up in conversation. In a moment, and I bring it up specifically because in a moment you're going to hear a failure story, and to you, it might sound really surface level. Like you'd be like, you call that failure? I'll show you failure. But I can tell you without any doubt that the person sharing that story with you always feels more vulnerable than you hear as the listener. So I wanted to highlight that one, just to recognize the courage that it takes to share a story and appreciate that when someone is willing to do that. And then ask those so what and now what questions that help your tellers dive into learning, which is what we're going to practice with the activity in a moment here. I invite us all to embrace these practices and practice being good listeners when you are about to listen to the story in a minute here. But we also need to become great tellers. So again, I'd like you just to take maybe a moment to reflect individually this time. What did you like about how Hillary and Gavin shared their stories? Putting them on the spot again. What makes a good failure story? What helps you as the listener learn and appreciate the experience that they went through? Is there anything you can do as a teller? Don't blame is the biggest one. Obviously, any failure we're talking about is caused by multiple factors. No one's denying that. But if you spend your time blaming, you don't consider what you could have done differently, so you're really undermining what you can learn. A great way to get around blaming is to consider the perspectives of the person that you could potentially blame. And imagine sharing the story with them sitting right in front of you, or even better, up on stage with you, and you're just sharing their perspective. Or possibly the best, ask them and have them share the story with you. Because it's amazing how rich the learning comes from when you include perspectives from other people. Looking for those root causes, doing that analysis, and focusing on the learning, which is what we are about to do. So this is the moment you've all been waiting for. So you're going to get into partners, and you can decide for yourself who is the teller first and who is the listener first. One of you will be the teller, one of you will be the listener, and the teller will have just 60 seconds to share their failure story. 60 seconds, not a lot of time. And then the listener will ask questions to help the teller dive into the learning. And then that same teller will tell their story one more time, framed in terms of the conversation they just had, in terms of what they learned. And this time, I'm only going to give you 30 seconds. And then we're going to switch. Listeners become tellers, tellers become listeners. We do it all over again, so everybody gets to play both roles. Something you might want to pay attention to is that this will be a challenge. It is incredibly difficult to share a story of failure in 60 seconds, let alone 30 seconds. That is the point. The point is to really experience failure in a whole new way, practice communicating it a whole new way, and really get to the heart of our failure stories and the learning that's within them. I invite you again to pick your failure, no blaming, as well as a professional failure, because we're in a professional context. Find your partners, think about what your story sounds like, and then we'll get started. Thank you, tellers. I realize that was very difficult. Listeners, your turn to do just a tiny bit of work. I invite our listeners to ask those curious questions, those so what and now what questions that help our tellers dive into what they can learn from their stories. So I have put up a handful of example questions. You are free to just read these questions, go through the list, but also feel free to bring in any questions that you're curious about. What do you think, what question would really help the teller dive into the experience, figure out what they can learn from it, what the story means? Some of the examples that I have here, why does this failure matter? Why is it important to share? What would you do differently? How has your understanding of the situation changed since this happened? And my personal favorite, how would other characters in this story talk about this failure? So, like I said, feel free to use those. Also, feel free to ask any other questions you're curious about, and I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes for that discussion, and then the tellers get to tell their story one more time. as promised, our tellers have one more very hard job to do before we switch roles. I invite same folks that shared their failure story the first time, share your story one more time. But this time, I'm only going to give you 30 seconds, because everybody likes a challenge. And I would love if you would take a few moments to consider, what does your story sound like in terms of the discussion you just had, in terms of what you learned from that experience? And share your story in 30 seconds, framed in terms of what you learned. So that's the challenge to our tellers. All right, tellers, your 30 seconds starts now. Great job, everyone. I really do appreciate how challenging that can be. I'm going to invite Hillary and Gavin back up to the stage to join us for the last part of this activity. But just before I do that, I want everyone to turn to their partners and just thank them for the courage to share their story. All right, so last bit of this activity, as I promised, was to give everyone a chance to think about, what do we do with this experience? We've explored that relationship and that tension between risk aversion and innovation, and how important it is to acknowledge our failures and be open about them so we can maximize what we can learn from them. It's, as I've mentioned, fairly easy to do that in this very safe conference setting. How do we take these experiences and these insights home to our offices? What are we going to do differently? And I realize it is quite a large gap between share your failure and change your organization. But that is the challenge I put to you for the last few minutes of this session. What is one thing, and it can be a small thing, it doesn't have to be some big heroic act, but what is one thing that you can do to bring these concepts back to your offices as you depart this conference? Now again, I realize that's a big leap. Fortunately, we have our fabulous Gavin and Hillary back up here to help give us some ideas. So what's, perhaps you can start us off and get the brainstorm rolling. What's one thing that you can, will, or perhaps have done to bring these concepts back to your offices?
Sure. Well, just actually learning from my partner in the last exercise about managing expectations. I think it sounded like it's very important to be upfront about what the objectives are, the realism of how you can actually get those done, and trying not to overpromise things. And sorry if I'm breaking any transparency things. I should have asked permission first.
Yeah, sure. One thing you can do differently.
In my last organization, we did a couple of these. Always wanted to do them regularly, but never really got in the habit of it, because it is hard to get people to tell stories. But we did something called FailCon, where we would extend our weekly all hands by a half hour, or make it an hour or so, and we would take half of that and essentially encourage people to tell stories, and encourage people to tell small stories of small failures, or oh my gosh, I just really borked this one up. But it does show bravery, and it does show your peers, I think, that we all make mistakes. But the thing that I would build on what the gentleman over there said is, I would love to, I think, take that same idea where we're encouraging people to tell stories on a regular basis, but also work something like this in, because I would go even a little bit farther. Is what I was thinking sitting there when you were asking that question is, the second time it almost seemed like a success. So failure had become a success, and that is so powerful, I think, to go through just the simple exercise that you just walked us through, and to understand that when you learn something from something like that, that is a success. There's a mantra in the digital world: only new mistakes. So it's fine to make mistakes, but make new mistakes.
Thank you, guys. So now it's your turn to come up with one thing that you can do differently. To help, I've put up a few examples from other organizations that I have worked with, starting with, maybe you can write your own failure report. You can look at your organization's values. Does learning belong in there? How are you getting feedback from your stakeholders? Can you get that more rapidly? Are you doing those after-action reviews regularly? Is there a barrier to learning that you can break down? Perhaps including learning from failure as a part of what you evaluate in performance assessments, looking at past lessons learned reports that are like sitting on a shelf collecting dust, revisiting those. Did we apply those learnings? And an important one, because I know we all lead very, very busy lives, what can you stop doing so that you have time for reflection and learning? Whatever it is, what's one small thing you can do?
To be right. The teacher is always right. And the students try to be right. And as one of these young ladies said, the best way to be right is not to say anything, then you won't be wrong. Now, I believe the exact opposite, which is you cannot learn anything unless you make a mistake. So I tell my students, when you make a mistake, celebrate. And the way to celebrate is like this. How fascinating! It's actually quite difficult. Try it out on the golf course next time you're out. You know why it's difficult is because when we make a mistake, we tend to pull down, the body pull down. Notice the next time you make a mistake, the body pulls down. Now instead, when it pulls down, you go, how fascinating. It's like this. It's difficult to do, you know.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Thank you to Gavin and Hillary. And thank you to all of you for your courage and willingness to engage.